I walked into the courtroom as cameras exploded in my face, shutters snapping so fast it sounded like rain on metal, and for a split second, I truly believed this would be the moment my family finally succeeded in humiliating me in front of the whole city, until the judge looked up from the file, adjusted his glasses, and asked one quiet question that made my father go completely still, wiped the smug smile off my brother's face, and drained every bit of color from their lawyers' skin. That question wouldn't come until later. But standing there in that moment, my palms damp, my back straight, I had no way of knowing how quickly everything was about to turn. The courthouse smelled the way all courthouses do: old paper, floor polish, and something faintly metallic. Like nerves outside, the local news vans were parked crooked along the curb, logos peeling, antennas rattling in the spring wind. This wasn't a federal trial, it wasn't a murder case, it was a family lawsuit, a business dispute, the kind of thing that usually stays quiet, but my father had made sure it didn't. He liked attention, always had. I caught a glimpse of him across the hallway before we were called in. He stood tall in his navy blazer, silver hair perfectly combed, one hand resting on the shoulder of his golden son, my older brother, Mark. Mark was wearing that same smile he'd worn since childhood whenever he thought he was about to win. The smile that said, "You never stood a chance." Their lawyer hovered nearby, confident, expensive, already rehearsing the press-friendly version of the story in his head. They looked like a picture from a business magazine, the patriarch, the heir, the legal muscle, and then there was me, alone, no entourage, no lawyer whispering in my ear, just a plain navy jacket, sensible heels, hair pulled back neatly. I could already hear the assumptions forming in everyone's minds. She's the difficult one. She's back for money she thinks she deserves. Something she didn't earn. The bailiff called us in, and the courtroom filled quickly. A few reporters recognized my father and whispered to each other. Someone in the gallery leaned forward, eager. This was going to be entertaining, they thought, a public family reckoning. If only they knew. As I took my seat at the small table opposite my father, I felt the familiar weight of being underestimated settle over me. I'd lived with it my entire life. It was almost comforting now, like an old coat. The judge entered, a man in his early 60s, tired eyes, no nonsense posture. He glanced around the room, then down at the thick folder in front of him. He hadn't formed an opinion yet, I could tell, and that mattered, while preliminary motions droned on. My mind drifted back to how we'd ended up here, under fluorescent lights, with strangers watching our family come apart. My father had built what everyone called an empire, not skyscrapers or private jets. Something quieter, more solid, more American: commercial properties, storage facilities, small manufacturing spaces leased to local companies, warehouses along the interstate. The kind of wealth that didn't shout, but lasted. Mark had been groomed for it since he was a teenager, rode along to job sites, sat in on meetings, learned how to talk big and read little. I was the other child, the one who didn't fit, the one who asked questions, the one who left. When I told them I was choosing a life of service instead of joining the family business, my father nodded like he understood, but I saw it in his eyes: disappointment, relief. One less complication. After that, they stopped counting me. Years passed, contracts were signed, properties were transferred. Stories were told at country club dinners about the son who would inherit it all, and I was spoken of in the past tense, even though I was very much alive. The lawsuit came as a shock only in how bold it was. My father claimed I was interfering in business operations I had no legal standing in, that I was confused, misinformed, trying to take what wasn't mine. Mark laughed when the papers were served, actually laughed. She thinks she owns something, he told anyone who would listen. Sitting there now, listening to their lawyer lay out the story they'd crafted, I felt a flicker of anger, but it passed quickly. Anger clouds judgment. I'd learned that the hard way long ago. The lawyer spoke smoothly, confidently, painted me as an absent daughter with no understanding of the business, no role in its success, and certainly no claim to its future. Heads in the gallery nodded. It made sense on the surface. When it was my turn, I stood and steadied my voice. I answered simply, directly. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself emotionally. I let the documents speak when asked. And when I wasn't asked, I waited. My father watched me closely now. The smile on his face had faded. A faint crease formed between his brows. He sensed something, though he didn't yet know what. Then the judge leaned back in his chair, flipped a page, paused. He looked up and asked that one question. The room seemed to hold its breath. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't glare. He simply held the file a little higher. Like its weight surprised him. "Ms. Carter," he said, "before we go any further, I need to understand one thing. Who exactly has been signing as the controlling party on these assets for the last 8 years?" It didn't sound dangerous. It sounded administrative, almost boring. But I saw what it did to the table across from me. My father's shoulders went rigid, not dramatic, not theatrical, just rigid, like a man who'd stepped onto thin ice and suddenly felt it shift. Mark's smile didn't fade. It fell away, as if it had never belonged on his face in the first place, and their lawyer, so smooth, so sure of himself, blinked hard, swallowed, glanced down at his binder like it had betrayed him. I kept my hands folded. I didn't look at my father. I didn't look at Mark. I looked at the judge, and I waited, because the truth doesn't need to be rushed. The judge's eyes moved from me to the attorney. "Counsel," their lawyer cleared his throat. "Your Honor, I'm not sure that's relevant to the central issue. The plaintiff, Mr. Carter, has operated the business for decades. The defendant has been absent." The judge raised a hand. "I'm asking because I'm looking at a chain of documents that does not match what I was told in your opening." The sentence was small, quiet, but it landed like a weight for a moment. The courtroom made that soft collective sound people make when they don't want to speak but can't help reacting. A shuffle, a breath, a murmur swallowed. Then the judge looked back down at his file, and the hearing continued. Because judges don't do drama, they do procedure. But the air in the room had changed. This wasn't entertainment anymore. It was uncertainty. And uncertainty is the one thing men like my father can't tolerate. If you asked my father how he built his empire, he'd tell you it was hard work, early mornings, long meetings, risks no one else would take. He'd say he sacrificed everything for his family. That was the story he loved. The truth was more complicated, and I was old enough now to admit it without bitterness. My father was good at seeing what other people ignored. In the late 80s and early 90s, when our little Ohio town was still shaking off closed factories and the interstate was bringing in new shipping routes, he started buying properties nobody wanted. Crumbling storage lots, empty warehouses with leaky roofs, a small trucking yard that smelled like diesel and rust. He didn't buy them with cash, he bought them with confidence, bank loans, partnerships, handshakes. At first, it wasn't glamorous. My mother would sit at the kitchen table with a calculator, paying bills and balancing stacks of receipts, while my father talked about the next deal like it was the second coming. We didn't vacation, we didn't have fancy cars, we had stability, which felt like luxury back then. I can admit now, he did work hard, he did take risks. But he also had a talent for taking credit for things women did quietly. My mother managed the books for years. She tracked every payment, every loan, every property transfer. She kept the business alive when cash was thin and the margins were thinner, and when she got Sick, everything changed. No standing. That I had never had any standing. It was subtle, clever, even, the kind of maneuver that would slide past anyone who didn't know exactly what to look for. They were trying to collapse the scaffolding my mother had built, quietly. Legally, irreversibly, that letter is what forced my hand, not anger, not resentment, necessity. I contacted a law firm I trusted, not flashy, not famous, the kind that does estate law, trust law. Corporate governance, the boring, lethal kind of law that actually decides who owns what when everyone stops pretending. I sent them copies of everything I had. They went quiet for 3 days. Then the senior partner called me himself, Miss Carter. He said carefully, "Do they know what they're trying to do to you?" "No," I said, "they think I'm invisible." There was a pause. "Well," he said, almost gently, "you're not." That was when I learned exactly how deep my mother's planning went, how many contingencies she'd anticipated, how many signatures my father had provided over the years without reading closely, how many amendments had been executed during her illness when he was distracted, grieving, and desperate to keep things functioning. My name wasn't just on a few documents, it was on the spine of the whole structure, not publicly. Not obviously, but legally, the firm advised me to do nothing at first. Let them make the next move. Let them overreach. People who think they already won almost always do. And that's exactly what my father and Mark did. They filed suit. They claimed I was interfering, that I was confused, misinformed, delusional. They asked the court to formally declare that I had no ownership, no authority, no right to involvement. They dragged it into the open, into the cameras, into the courtroom. Because my father still believed in dominance as strategy, because Mark still believed charm counted as competence, and because neither of them had ever truly believed my mother or I were capable of out-hinking them, which is how we ended up here, under fluorescent lights, with reporters whispering, with a judge holding a file that told a very different story than the one my father had rehearsed. After that first question, things moved slowly, procedurally, methodically, exactly the way dangerous things move in court. Their lawyer tried to recover. He reframed, redirected, argued relevance. The judge listened, took notes, asked for specific documents to be entered into the record. And when those documents were displayed on the courtroom monitors, I heard my father make a sound I had never heard in my life. Not anger, not outrage, fear. It was quiet, almost imperceptible. But I heard it because I'd grown up listening for what wasn't said. The judge adjusted his glasses again. "Mr. Carter," he said, looking directly at my father for the first time, "are you aware that for the last 8 years, your daughter has been listed as the sole controlling trustee of the holding entity that owns 62% of these properties?" The courtroom went dead silent. Mark turned to his lawyer. "What does that mean?" he whispered. The lawyer didn't answer. He couldn't. My father opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "That's not possible," he said. "She left. She hasn't been involved in anything." The judge nodded once. "That may be," he said. "But involvement and authority are not the same thing." Then he looked at me. "Ms. Carter," he said, "can you confirm for the record whether you have exercised any control over these assets in the last 8 years?" "Yes, Your Honor," I said, not loudly, not dramatically. "I've approved leases, refinancings, insurance policies, and structural changes to ownership entities." My father's head snapped toward me. "You did what?" he said. I didn't look at him. I kept my eyes on the judge. "Yes," I continued. "Through legal counsel and third-party administrators, my role was intentionally non-public." Mark stood up halfway out of his chair. "This is insane," he said. "She hasn't been anywhere near the business." The judge raised a hand. "Sit down, Mr. Carter." Mark sat hard. The judge flipped another page. "According to these records," he said, "your late wife executed a series of amendments transferring controlling authority to your daughter contingent on her continued good standing and legal capacity. Those conditions were met, those transfers were valid, and those changes were never reversed." My father's face had gone grey. Not pale, grey, like something inside him had finally shut down. "You knew," he said hoarsely, looking at me now. "You knew all this time." "Yes," I said. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because you didn't need to know, I thought. Because you would have tried to break it. Because you never respected the kind of power that doesn't announce itself." But out loud, I said something else. Because nothing required me to. The judge leaned back. "This court will need time to review the implications," he said. "But based on what I'm seeing, the defendant appears to hold majority controlling authority over the assets in question." The reporters exploded, cameras clicking. Whispers ripping through the gallery. Mark looked like he might throw up. Their lawyer looked like he'd aged 10 years in 30 seconds. And my father looked small, for the first time in my life. Court recessed shortly after that. In the hallway, my father tried to speak to me. I walked past him, not out of cruelty, out of clarity. This wasn't revenge, this wasn't triumph, this was accountability arriving 8 years late. The case didn't end that day, but it ended. In truth, the court ruled that my father and brother had no legal right to restructure, sell, or encumber any major assets without my written consent. It ruled that their lawsuit had no merit. And it opened an inquiry into attempted misrepresentation. Mark lost his position as acting executive. My father was forced into retirement, and I didn't take over. That's the part people always get wrong. I didn't swoop in and become the new queen of the empire. I appointed professional management, independent auditors, external oversight. I turned the business into something that didn't depend on one man's ego or one family's dysfunction. I did exactly what my mother had designed it to do: survive them. I still don't attend board meetings in person. I still don't give interviews. I still live the same quiet life I always did. But every month, I review reports, and every quarter, I sign documents, and every year, I visit my mother's grave and tell her she was right about everything. As for my father and brother, they don't speak to me, and that's fine. I didn't go to court to humiliate them. They did that to themselves. I went to court because the truth doesn't care who raised you, and because silence only works as long as the other side behaves. Mine didn't, and that one quiet question from a tired judge, it didn't destroy my family, it revealed it. And sometimes that's the only justice you ever get. No standing, no authority, no place in something I had helped protect simply by staying quiet. I made one phone call that day, not to my father, not to Mark. To someone who knew how to read between lines. The response was calm, professional. "They've misunderstood what they're dealing with," he said, "or they're hoping you won't push back." I didn't push back right away. I waited, because timing matters. Because confronting people too early gives them time to fix their story, and because I didn't want this resolved with shouting. I wanted it resolved with truth, documented, dated, undeniable. The lawsuit arrived months later, aggressive, public, framed as a defense of the family business against a wayward daughter. My father must have thought I'd panic, that I'd fold, that I'd settle quietly for some small concession just to keep the peace. He never understood that peace doesn't come from surrender, it comes from clarity. So I gathered what needed gathering, reviewed what needed reviewing, prepared, not emotionally, but methodically. And then, on a bright spring morning, I walked into that courthouse alone. They thought I was absent. They thought I was unprepared. They thought the empire belonged to the man who talked the loudest. They had no idea everything they relied on was already written down, clear as ink on paper, waiting for the one moment when silence would no longer be enough. By the time we returned to the courtroom after the short recess, the mood had changed, not dramatically, but unmistakably. The gallery wasn't buzzing anymore. People weren't leaning forward for entertainment. They were sitting back, watching carefully, the way people do when they realize they might be witnessing something real. Something that won't end the way they expected. My father felt it too. He kept adjusting his cuff, kept glancing at his lawyer more than before. Mark had stopped smiling entirely. He stared straight ahead, jaw tight, like a man forcing himself not to look at a crack forming beneath his feet. The judge resumed without ceremony. Calm, precise, he restated my father's claims. Interference, lack of standing, that I was an outsider trying to disrupt a business I had no legal connection to. Then he turned to me. "Ms. Carter," he said, "you've chosen to represent yourself today. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor." A few heads tilted in the gallery. Self-representation always does that. People assume arrogance, or desperation, or ignorance, rarely preparation. The judge nodded. "I want to be very clear," he said. "This court is not interested in family grievances. I am interested in authority, documentation, and legal responsibility. Do you understand?" "I do." He leaned back slightly. "Then let's proceed." My father's lawyer stood. Again, confidence creeping back in small increments, like a man talking himself into believing everything was still under control. He called the first witness, the operations manager, a decent man, nervous, caught between loyalty and truth. The lawyer guided him gently, who made decisions, who approved expenses, who signed contracts. Mostly Mr. Carter, the witness said. "Recently, Mark." The lawyer smiled, satisfied. He turned to the judge. "As you can see, Your Honor, Ms. Carter has not been involved in any meaningful capacity. She has no operational role, no managerial authority." The judge nodded, writing something down. Then he looked at me. "Ms. Carter, your cross." I stood, smoothed the front of my jacket, walked a few steps closer, not aggressively, just enough to be heard. "Good morning," I said to the witness. "You mentioned contract approvals. When you say approval, do you mean who authorized the action, or who had final legal authority?" He hesitated. "I suppose those are different things." "They are," I said gently. "So who had final legal authority?" "Well," he said slowly, "we usually followed instructions from Mr. Carter, or Mark." "Usually," I repeated, "but not always." He shifted. "Sometimes paperwork had to go through other channels." "What channels?" He glanced at my father, then back at me. "Trust administration, compliance review." "Thank you," I said. No further questions. It was a small exchange, easy to miss. But the judge's pen stopped moving. The next witnesses came, a banker, an accountant, careful professionals, precise with words. They confirmed what the first witness had hinted at. There were structures, oversight, limits my father had agreed to years earlier. Each time the lawyer tried to steer things back to habit and assumption, the truth slipped through. Finally, the judge looked at the thick folder again. He flipped several pages, then looked directly at my father's lawyer. "Counsel," he said, "I'm struggling to reconcile your argument with the documents I'm reading." The lawyer straightened. "Your Honor, operational control has always rested with my client. Any administrative structures were just that, administrative. These appear to be legal constraints." The judge interrupted. "They were precautionary," the lawyer said. "Precautionary against what?" Silence. My father cleared his throat. A small sound, but it echoed. "I've been running this business for 40 years, he said, standing. The judge looked at him calmly. "That may be true, Mr. Carter, but longevity is not the same as authority. Mark leaned toward him. Dad, sit down, the judge said. Mark sat, hard, for the first time in my life. Someone else had told my father what to do, and he obeyed. The judge turned back to me. Ms. Carter, he said, you've submitted several exhibits. Before we review them, I want to ask you directly, what is your claim? I didn't hesitate. My claim is not that I ran the business day to day, I said. My claim is that the business was never structured to belong solely to the loudest voice in the room. A few people shifted in the gallery. My father believes control comes from presence. I continued, from showing up, from being seen. The law doesn't work that way. The law works on intent, documentation, authority. The judge nodded slightly. This lawsuit wasn't brought because I interfered, I said. It was brought because my absence made people forget the limits of their power. My father stared at me, not angry, not smug, confused. Truly confused, like a man realizing the rules he'd lived by his whole life were incomplete. The judge looked back down at the file. We're going to review Exhibit C, he said, and then I'm going to ask some very specific questions. The lawyer's hand trembled as he flipped pages. As the clerk passed out copies, I saw it happen, understanding. Not fully, not yet, but enough to unsettle. This case was no longer about whether I deserved a place at the table. It was about whether the table had ever belonged to them at all. The judge studied Exhibit C quietly, the way a mechanic studies an engine, thorough, unimpressed by noise. The courtroom went still. That special stillness when people realize the outcome no longer belongs to the loudest speaker. Counsel, the judge said at last, this document predates the current structure of the business by several years. Yes, Your Honor, the lawyer said carefully. It was executed during a transitional period. A transitional period, the judge repeated. During a medical emergency, the lawyer nodded. That is correct, and it establishes a controlling framework, the judge continued, that limits unilateral decision-making and places ultimate authority elsewhere. Elsewhere, the word landed hard. Mark leaned toward my father, whispering urgently. My father didn't move. He just stared at the paper, at the truth he'd never bothered to read, and for the first time, I understood something clearly. This wasn't the moment everything fell apart. It was the moment everything finally lined up. My father shook his head slowly, deliberately, like a man refusing to accept what his ears were telling him. He had spent his entire life equating authority with presence. If you showed up, you ruled. If you were in the room, you were in charge. It had always been that simple. Until now. The judge turned to me. Double quotes, Ms. Carter. He said, I want you to explain something for the record. In plain terms, no legal jargon. I nodded. Double quotes, yes, Your Honor. He tapped the document lightly. Why was this structure created? I took a breath. This was the moment where truth mattered more than strategy, because unchecked power is dangerous. I said calmly, even in families, especially in families. A murmur moved through the gallery. Not judgment, recognition. My mother understood that the business had grown beyond personalities. I continued. She believed it needed protection. From impulsive decisions, from internal pressure, and from the assumption that seniority automatically equals wisdom. My father let out a sharp breath. That's not, Mr. Carter, the judge said gently but firmly. You'll have an opportunity to respond. He turned back to me. Go on. The structure wasn't designed to punish anyone, I said. It was designed to preserve the business for the long term, to ensure continuity, accountability, stability. And who, the judge asked, was designated to hold that authority? I felt every eye in the room settle on me. I said simply. The silence that followed was absolute. My father's face went slack. Like a man realizing the ground beneath him had never been solid to begin with, Mark's mouth opened. Slightly. Then. Closed. His expression wasn't anger, yet. It was disbelief, pure and unfiltered. The lawyer stood abruptly. Your Honor, if I may, this designation was symbolic at best. Ms. Carter was not present. She did not exercise control. The judge raised an eyebrow. Authority does not require daily presence, counsel. It requires legal standing. He turned to the clerk. Please pull the subsequent amendments. Pages flipped. Copies moved. Pen stopped scratching. The lawyer's confidence evaporated with every document placed on the table. According to these filings, the judge said, any major asset restructuring required consent from the controlling party, and according to these signatures, that consent was not obtained. The lawyer's face went paper white. He opened his mouth, closed it again. Mark stood up. This is insane, he said, his voice tight. She wasn't even here. She didn't earn this. The judge fixed him with a steady look. Sit down, Mr. Carter. Mark hesitated, just long enough to show how unused he was to being corrected. Then he sat. The judge leaned forward. Ms. Carter, did you at any point relinquish this authority? No, Your Honor. Did you delegate it? Yes. To whom? To a professional trustee and compliance team, I answered, to ensure the business could operate without disruption. The judge nodded. Double quotes. So while others managed operations, you retained oversight? Yes. And did you ever interfere? No. Why not? I paused. Because this answer mattered. Because nothing was being endangered, I said, and because silence in this case was not surrender, it was trust. The judge sat back. Trust, he repeated softly. My father's lawyer tried once more. Your Honor, even if authority technically rested elsewhere, my client acted in good faith. Good faith does not override written law, the judge said, nor does assumption replace consent. He turned to my father. Mr. Carter, you assumed control because no one stopped you. That does not mean you were entitled to it. My father stood slowly. As if his legs had aged 10 years in the last hour. I built this, he said, voice rough. I sacrificed for it. No one is disputing your contribution, the judge replied. But contribution is not ownership. And sacrifice does not nullify safeguards. The judge glanced around the courtroom. This case has been framed as a dispute between a father and daughter. It is not. It is a dispute between assumption and documentation. Then he said the sentence that changed everything. This court recognizes Ms. Carter as the controlling authority of the assets in question. The words hung in the air. Mark slumped back in his chair. Staring straight ahead, the lawyer closed his binder with trembling hands. Reporters scribbled furiously. My father didn't sit. He just stood there staring at me. Not with anger, but with something far more unsettling. Understanding. Not the full kind. Not yet, but enough to hurt. The judge continued outlining next steps. Compliance measures. Corrective actions. His voice became procedural again. Steady. Unemotional. But the correction had already been done. When the gavel finally came down, the courtroom broke into quiet chaos. Chairs scraped, voices rose, cameras flashed again, this time aimed at me. I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. I gathered my papers, thanked the clerk, turned to leave. As I passed my father's table, he reached out, his hand hovered. Unsure whether it was allowed to touch my arm. I didn't know, he said quietly. I stopped, looked at him. Really looked at him. You never asked, I replied, and for once, he had no answer. The hallway outside felt narrower than it had that morning. As if the building itself had shifted. Reporters clustered near the doors, questions fired like pellets. I kept my eyes forward, walked past without stopping. Not every truth. Needs a microphone. My father followed at a distance, not close enough to confront me. Not far enough to pretend he wasn't trying. Mark didn't come out right away. I didn't look back. In a small conference room down the hall, the judge requested a brief administrative meeting. No cameras. No audience. Just paperwork. Timelines. Instructions. The kind of quiet ending that never makes the news, but defines what actually happens next. The judge explained the ruling the way you'd explain something to a neighbor over a fence. Plain. Clear. Grounded. Double quotes Ms. Carter. He said, "Your restraint prevented a great deal of damage. That matters." I thanked him. Not formally. Honestly. When it ended, the clerk escorted me back into the hallway. My father was waiting near a window, hands clasped behind his back, staring at the parking lot. The confidence he'd worn like armor his entire life had cracked. What stood there now was an aging man confronting a reality he hadn't planned for. "Can we talk?" he asked. I nodded. We sat on a bench near the elevators. Away from the noise. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The building hummed around us. Footsteps, phones, elevator doors. "I never thought," he began, then stopped, tried again. "I didn't understand what your mother was doing back then." "I know," I said. He frowned. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I thought about that because you wouldn't have listened," I said, not unkindly, just truthfully, "and because it wasn't about you." He looked down at his hands. "I thought your silence meant you didn't care." "No," I said. "It meant I trusted the structure to do what it was designed to do." He shook his head, a bitter half smile tugging at his mouth. "All these years I thought control meant holding on tighter. That's how most people think," I said, "until something breaks." He sighed. Heavy with regret. "I taught Mark that if he stayed close, he'd be rewarded. And I learned," I replied, "that distance sometimes protects what closeness destroys." That one landed. He didn't argue. When Mark finally approached, he looked smaller, the bravado gone, something raw in its place. "So that's it?" he asked. "You win." I met his eyes. "This isn't about winning," he scoffed softly. "Easy to say now, Mark," I said quietly. "You were given opportunity. I was given responsibility. They aren't the same thing." He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. And for the first time in his life, he had nothing left to say. And so it ended, not with fireworks, not with declarations, not with grand gestures, but with the quiet, steady pulse of understanding. The empire remained, intact yet transformed. Because what holds a family, a business, a life together isn't always charisma, or charm, or even sacrifice. It's clarity, it's preparation, it's the invisible architecture that keeps chaos from slipping in while the world watches elsewhere. I didn't walk into that courtroom to humiliate or punish. I walked in to preserve truth, to honor the labor of those who came before me, and to prevent assumption from becoming law. And in doing so, I discovered something far more valuable than power: the strength to act responsibly, even when unseen, and the patience to let others learn the hard lessons quietly. Today, the meetings are calmer, the decisions deliberate, the trust earned and renewed. My father listens, Mark listens, and I watch the work continue, not as a show of control, but as proof that wisdom and responsibility can outlast pride and impulse. If this story lingers with you, let it be a reminder. The quiet ones, the steady hands, the people who prepare without applause, they often hold the truest authority. Protect your work. Trust your structures. Speak when the truth demands it. And remember, strength is not always loud. Sometimes strength is patient. Some lessons arrive too late for some, but for those who see them in time, they can change everything.